Stanford University.
This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.
Thank you, Karen. That was perfect. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry to be addressing you from a chair instead of from the lectern, but the fates did something to my knee, and so I'm glad to be here at all. This is a polemical talk in the sense that Stevens has been identified mostly, and often with hostility, as a poet who was not particularly American and who was closer to the expatriates, Eliot and Pound, perhaps, than he was to Frost and Hart Crane and other such American poets who made a great deal of the American scene, of American monuments, of American heroes. But I think he's a deeply American poet. He's not merely a Europhile or an elitist high modernist or the various other tags that have been put on him. But it annoys me that people don't recognize when he's writing about America, except when they see an actual name in a poem that will mention Tennessee or Oklahoma. Then he's an American poet. Otherwise, if there's not an American name or reference in the poem, he's not American. And this seems a very narrow criterion to me of what is American. And I would like to see literary histories of America and of American poetry think of Stevens as a deeply American poet and write about the views he has of America. Having said that, I want to, because I don't want this to go too long, I want to start briefly with where, I have to get my hand out, with where Stevens begins in thinking about how to be an American poet. It's very funny where he begins because mostly in some of his earlier poems, he had placed America against, as the paltry nude poem, where he thinks of a new Venus who will arise here out of the foam and so forth, calling her the goldener nude of a later day, that we will have a golden goddess ourselves, but she's not quite ready yet. But then he thought that instead of placing America against Europe, it might be interesting to think about the indigenous enemies, you might say, of poetry. And they are, interestingly for him, the South American Aztecs who wore their big feather capes. If you've ever seen one in a museum, I once saw one. They're astonishing garments, huge, long things, multicolored feathers all over them. And he imagines a little Bantam rooster confronting a great big rooster, and he addresses the rooster as an Aztec chief in a caftan of feathers. And therefore, he wants to define the new America against the indigenous America, you might say, of the Aztecs or the Mayan civilization or whatever might have been here before we got here. And it's very funny when he has the little rooster in Appalachia address the great big cock. Bantams in pine woods. Chieftain, if you can, of Azcan and caftan of tan with henna hackles, halt. Damned universal cock, as if the sun was blackamoor to bear your blazing tail. Fat, 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 fat. I am the personal. Your world is you, I am my world. You 10-foot poet among inchlings, fat, begone. An inchling bristles in these pines, bristles and points their Appalachian tangs and fears not portly Azcan nor his whoos. Whoos is Stevens' word for nonsense. He says the ocean cries who and rises and cries who and falls and then says life's nonsense pierces us with strange relation. So the nonsense of the other cultures is being objected to. Portly Azcan and his whoos is objected to by the little Bantam rooster. And yet Stevens, although he writes about himself in The Comedian as the letter C, his long autobiographical poem, stops in the South. He was native to the North. He was born in Pennsylvania. And he stops in the South, in the Carolinas. He represents himself in the comedian, as the letter C, as born in Bordeaux, European, coming across Bordeaux, going to Yucatan, South America, coming up to the southern United States, and then domesticating himself in the Carolinas. And when he's seeking whom he should imitate for such a poem, he chooses the long poem by Robert Browning, known as Sordello, about which the famous quip was that Browning once said that when he wrote Sordello, only God and he understood it, and now only God understands it. And so he chose this enormously complicated rhetoric to write the comedian's the letter C in. And as though the American poet had a right to all the Baroque flourishes available to anybody as complicated as Browning. But then he decided that really America couldn't have poetry written that way. And he comes in the comedian as the letter C, after really arguing for the Americans' right to every rhetorical flourish known to poetry. He declares that American poetry must spring from prose, in your next excerpt. And he says, as a young poet, when he renders that prose, he uses only high syntactic theatricality. I mean, if you think of stripping things down, you think of William Carlos Williams and little lines and little wheelbarrows. But instead, in this poem, when he announces his own vocation, he gripped more closely the essential prose as being in a world so falsified, the one integrity for him, the one discovery still possible to make, to which all poems were incident, unless, and then there's the dream, that prose should wear a poem's guise at last. So he's stuck, not knowing whether to write this high syntax or whether to sound like Browning or whether to sound, as he does in other cases like Keats or Stevens. He's steeped in the English tradition and literally doesn't know how American life, which seems so stripped down by comparison to the flourishes, when you think of them, all the way from the Renaissance on, of European art. He wonders whether you have to forego that elaborate syntax and vocabulary that have been indispensable to Western philosophy, religion, history, aesthetics, and poetry itself. Can the democratic poet rise to the greatest philosophical questions if he has to strip them of philosophical diction? Stevens says yes, and he offers an answer, 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, in which every sphere is haunted by the blackbird. Does the Bible say that man and wife should be two in one flesh? A lot has been written about that. A lot has been thought about it. Stevens writes, a man and a woman are one, that indisputable, as people think, proposition about marriage. And then the next line, a man and a woman and a blackbird are one. You might say the blackbird is always in the bed between the man and the wife, and it's like Poe's raven, of course. It looks back to Poe's raven. The raven is always sitting there in the middle of the falsity of two human beings of different genders, or now of the same gender, being able to make a oneness that is lasting. It's that sort of thing he will take up. It makes you think about marriage, why it is one-on-one, why we want to think that a man and a woman are one, in one flesh, says the Bible. And the blackbird keeps migrating around through 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, so that Stevens again takes up the philosophical principle of contradiction. A thing cannot be and not be the same way at the same time, and so on. And that's why people say, I am of two minds, supposing that one of these days you're going to straighten it out and be of one mind after you get rid of your ambivalence. Stevens says, I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. And therefore, ambiguity doesn't stop at two. It could be three. You could have 42 blackbirds in the tree as far as that goes. You could have many opinions about something. It's simply not true that you only have yes and no as answers. You have the whole spectrum of gray in between. Also, when he's seeing the blackbird in his own Connecticut, he implies that there are laws other than the laws of physics. That is, there are strange, compelling laws in Connecticut, and he quotes them in the last of these. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. You think, what connects the current of the river and the flying of the blackbird? And of course, it is the congruence, as Stevens sees it, between the natural world, the river, the current of life, you might say, always symbolized by the river that you can't step into twice, and the fact that above the river soars thought in 13 different ways, perhaps, or any number more. The eccentric, he says, is the base of design rather than the symmetry that we're used to in European art. So the blackbird is everywhere, making us think about what laws govern our universe and what philosophical principles or principles of religious injunction to in one flesh could be true. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird is, in a way, a New England primer proclaiming the omnipresence not of God but of the blackbird. It's his aggressive repudiation of the poetry, chiefly discursive, of his conventional American predecessors and contemporaries. If you think of Edwin Arlington Robinson or Conrad Aiken, they were writing long pentameters spun out, and this is 13 Ways is, of course, a manifesto, and taking American art down to its naked, bare bones, like that tree. You only see the three blackbirds when there's no foliage on the tree, of course, otherwise they'd be hidden. So it's a great eccentric picture, the three blackbirds. Anybody reading Stevens' collected poems is struck by how widely over the years Stevens casts his poetic net, hoping to catch genuine American fish. As he wrote in his notebook, and I think this should be printed at the head of every headnote describing Stevens in textbooks, he wrote, "Nothing could be more inappropriate to American literature than its English source, since the Americans are not British in sensibility, and we're not. So that there has to be a different sensibility, and that will express itself in different symbolic forms from what the English found." He saw his own task as the evocation of a specifically American sensibility, but he rapidly perceived that a reductive bonfire of the Western literary inheritance doesn't automatically create an American culture. If you burn up all the rest, what are you left with but ash? For the rest of his life, Stevens asks what will or can take the place of what has been lost or destroyed. What will American culture become? What does it need? Who will be its heroes? Where will it find happiness? How would the imaginative artist, stripped of patronage, of course, in a democratic system, redefine his own function when he's no longer a court ornament or the person who sings the praises of the heroes of the culture? Because Stevens' poems usually present such essential topics at a symbolic remove, without specific mention of America, critics describe Stevens' theory of cultural modernity without reference to its native origins in the land and in his own psyche. I see Stevens' theories as a set of urgent discoveries springing from his specifically American plight. I've chosen, I think perversely probably, but nonetheless, my examples tonight are 3 poems from Stevens' 31-canto sequence called Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. He considered it his major theoretical poem, and it was done in that provisional way of the 3 blackbirds in the tree. It is not a supreme fiction, but it's notes toward a supreme fiction. It's the sort of thing didn't Eliot have notes towards the definition of culture or something like that? It was this notes toward, it's the modesty, topos, the modesty showing of the self, but still, it's a very serious and important poem with a lot of symbolic figures in it. I think that this is a natural place to look for the poet's American sensibility. A supreme fiction is Stevens' name for an ideal of perfection which is by definition unattainable, like all perfection. But he thinks that that perfection can stand, although unattainable, can stand as a model for human imaginative invention. It's what people should be thinking about making. In this, he follows Lucretius and Montaigne, among others, in specifying what such an ideal fiction might be. Montaigne says, for instance, in the Apology for Raymond Simon, that very funny essay, that Pythagoras taught that the being of beings must be, and it's wonderful, it's like Housel, disappointed, unannealed in Hamlet. The being of beings must be undefined, unprescribed, undeclared, that it was nothing else but the utmost effort of our imagination towards perfection, each man amplifying the idea of it according to his capacity. That's Montaigne. Stevens leaves his supreme fiction undefined because, as Montaigne says, it's undefined, unprescribed, undeclared. But he declares that it's recognized by its three essential characteristics. You'll know a supreme fiction if you come upon one because it will exhibit these three indispensable characteristics. It must be abstract, he says. That means it mustn't be merely topical. It can't just talk about, the car crash that happened last night or whatever. But it has to be raised to a different plane, a plane of abstraction, which we would call a symbolic plane or a metaphorical plane. He never does first-order transcriptions of his life, never. He always turns it into Bantams and a Rooster. That's even when he's at his most personal, I am the personal. He translates it to a fictive plane. So that the poem has to be, the supreme fiction has to be abstract, not merely topical. So, and you do that so that its symbolic form will be widely applicable, so everybody can participate in it. It won't be restricted to your particular self, history, nature, gender, place of living, whatever. Second thing, after it must be abstract, it must change, or else it wouldn't participate in the flux of life. Life for Stevens is always in motion. It is that current. And the third characteristic, after it must be abstract and it must change, is it must give pleasure, or nobody would ever read the poem again. I mean, to perpetuate culture, it has to give pleasure. Pleasure is the motive of culture. These qualities, which are enjoined on creators if you're a poet and you want to create a poem, it must be abstract, it must change, and it must give pleasure. These qualities are the heading for the 3 10-canto parts of Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. I offer a sample canto from each of the 3 sections in the hope of showing Stevens' intense Americanness in lines which nowhere mention America. A supreme fiction, in Stevens' thought, is an interpretation of life that makes sense to a whole culture, as Greek tragedy or Shakespearean drama or Christian theology did in their day. The supreme fiction cannot be peculiar, relevant only to a few alienated persons. It must be, and Stevens repeats this over and over, it must be normal. Stevens is essentially a comic poet. He's not a poet of catastrophe and tragedy. He wants to talk about ordinary life as people live it. Like Jesus' parables of the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan, the supreme fiction is advanced by means of universally applicable symbolic anecdotes. The imagined dramatis personae of these anecdotes, we'll see some, serve as representatives of the human condition. Emily Dickinson wrote to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, "When I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person." It's hard to remember that when she's always writing I and me, but it's true. She's writing as a symbolic person rather than as a native of Amherst at a particular moment. For poets most committed to symbolic abstraction, an openly autobiographical narrative is merely distracting. They believe with Aristotle that poetry, because it is philosophical, a second-order reflection rather than a first-order transcription, that poetry is truer than history because it rises to that philosophic abstraction. My first example from the section of notes called "It Must Be Abstract" is a poem, and I will read it in a minute, but let me introduce it to you first. It's a poem about the weather, a strange topic, the weather of a particular day. He said that as it represents and is represented by that abstraction proper to symbol. Montaigne reminds his readers that the philosopher Anaximenes thought that air, immense, ever moving, was a god, and you can imagine Stevens thinking the same here about the weather. By what analogy, Stevens asks, can the American poet represent abstraction itself? What will be the symbol for abstraction? He had been attempting before the poem began, as you can see when the poem starts, it begins, he had been attempting to define the abstract by turning to quasi-theological terms, as we'll see, but finding these terms passé, he must turn away from definition to example. What American quality or object can symbolize abstract Americanness? It can't come from architecture. American architecture is so heterogeneous as to have no abstractable unity. Neither do the other American arts or the varieties of American religion offer an abstractable unity. Can an American supreme fiction be represented by a symbolic national landscape? Perhaps it could in Europe, where countries are small, relatively, and a single symbol could stand for the whole, the way Alps betoken Switzerland and dikes conjure up Holland. But the American landscape is too various to embody a single descriptive symbol. The only sufficiently broad phenomenon available to all, thinks Stevens, is weather, which surrounds us and generates the atmosphere in which we live. But what is weather taken alone, not specified as fine weather or stormy weather or hot weather, but merely as weather? It can't be seen, certainly. It can't be defined. It doesn't talk to us. It doesn't enter into colloquy with us. It's without limits, stretching as it does into the infinity of the sky. It doesn't produce anything, as plants produce fruit. It makes no characteristic sound. Weather exists even when the birds aren't singing. It's not penetrable. It doesn't drop its garment to show us its nakedness underneath. Although it may be its cincture, its ceinture, he uses the French name, it may be loosened, that cincture, enough for us to perceive an underlayer of its changing seasonal vesture, because the weather does change with the seasons. The weather has no standard name, as a goddess might, Demeter, or as a season might, autumn. It's too large, finally, to be a target of human desire. We could desire almost anything, but nobody says, I desire weather. I mean, it's too big to desire. When we ask what other phenomenon we might find resembling weather in its abstraction, we could mention, for instance, fragrance. It's everywhere around us when it's there, something diffuse, uncapturable, in motion. Weather can hardly be called a visible substance, but neither is it invisible. Is it both? It is both something we see now and something we remember having seen in the past. It is air, and we might want to imagine a genius loci, a genius of the spirit of the place in the old Latin version. A giant of the weather, Stevens calls it, some sort of god of the weather, presiding over the changes that weather shows. We might think of the melancholy genius loci of September, say, or the agitated spirit of hurricane. What in us is weather most like? Just as we live physically by currents of blood that circulate through our bodies, so we live intellectually and emotionally by currents that circulate through our minds and sustain our thoughts. Weather is, he says, an abstraction blooded as a man by thought. It is weather. It is, says Stevens, and now you can see what he says, it is not to be realized because not to be seen, not to be loved nor hated because not to be realized. Weather by Franz Hals, brushed up by brushy winds and brushy clouds, wetted by blue, colder for white. Not to be spoken to, without a roof, without first fruits, without the virginal of birds, the dark-blown ceinture loosened, not relinquished. Gay is, gay was, the gay forsythia, and yellow, yellow thins the northern blue. Without a name, and nothing to be desired, if only imagined, but imagined well. My house has changed a little in the sun. The fragrance of the magnolias comes close, false flick, false form, but falseness close to kin. It must be visible or invisible, invisible or visible, or both, a seeing and unseeing in the eye. The weather and the giant of the weather, say the weather, the mere air, an abstraction blooded as a man by thought. Before composing these lines, Stevens has decided to offer weather as an abstract symbol for a poetry faithful to an American sensibility, Weather is anything but static, anything but logical, anything but theological, anything but fixed, anything but philosophical. None of that. Given our huge geographical extent and variation in climate, how will he render that weather in words, and how will he connect it to his own calling, which is to be an American poet? The charm of the poem lies in part in its combination of a grand atmospheric language, brushed up by brushy winds, lifting us to the sky, and then in a charming change in the poem, little inconsequent flower songs that return us to the earth. The first little flower song is about color. Gay is, gay was, the gay forsythia, and yellow, yellow, sounds like a bird song, yellow, yellow, thins the northern blue. The second little song is about fragrance. The fragrance of the magnolias comes close, false flick, false form, but falseness close to kin. The yellowness of forsythia and the fragrance of magnolias are not transcendent symbols like the lily of Mary the Virgin, nor the rose of the Romance of la Rose, nor are they patriotic symbols like the amber waves of grain that we've been hearing so much about. They simply are spring instances of things that make us happy. The American poet does not need the giant sublimity of the Shelleyan Alps, nor a Keatsian goddess of autumn reclining in the landscape. Nor does he need a lofty ethical conclusion of the fortifying sort. Oh, sorry, thank you very much. No, neither does he need a lofty ethical conclusion of the fortifying sort offered by Wordsworth after he encountered the ancient leech gatherer on the moor. You know, if he's faint of heart, I'll think of the leech gatherer. No, ethics, incidentally, says Stevens elsewhere, ethics are no more a part of poetry than they are of painting. That's probably his most provocative statement. Stevens closes with a hymn to the weather, having gotten rid of the genius, the giant of the weather. Stevens closes with a hymn to the weather, the mere air. Mere is ostensibly a gesture of dismissive satisfaction, but what Stevens implies is, yes, the weather is mere and nothing more, but isn't it in its constant freshness enough for happiness? In Stevens' contemporary Robert Frost, weather is still personal and can be spoken to. Oh, hushed October, morning mild, tree at my window, window tree. Frost doesn't welcome with Stevens' visual relish the primitive energies of weather brushed up by brushy winds and brushy clouds. The painterly parallels confirm Stevens' wish for an unapologetic rendering of the world of the senses without demanding more of that world than it can give. The nostalgic idealisms of the world, whether religious or patriotic, find such a sensual satisfaction insufficient. But in Stevens' view, idealisms become sentimental because they do not allow for the non-ideal, as Stevens here does by admitting that the weather is the mere weather, not a transcendent thing, and that the fragrance is not quite what he desires, but it does come close. Idealisms, he said, decline into a pallid, backward gaze. The ideal, says Stevens, is the actual become anemic, a wonderful definition of the ideal. It's faded actual, only because people can't make the actual into a transcendent object, so to make it into an ideal, they have to sort of take away everything that gives it any vim or vigor, and therefore it becomes pallid as an ideal. Stevens' weather, arriving vigorously upon the page, dispenses with a main verb, as you can see the way it starts. The weather is not given by someone, it is not received by anyone, it merely is. And the poet's momentary temptation to install a genius loci, the giant of the weather, is immediately rejected. As Stevens says in the canto that follows, it feels good as it is, without the giant. Try to imagine a poem such as this being written in England or France, and you will see how Stevens' poem deliberately floats free of explicit historical or allusive ground, except for the unnamed intimation of Venus in the foamy waves, and the elusive use of Paul's phrase from the 1 Corinthians, first fruits. In projecting the weather as his object of attention, Stevens imagines the American artist not, as in his earlier poem, Anecdote of the Jar, as a rueful middleman between art and wilderness, but rather as a creator set free within the elemental and inhuman dynamism of the universe, an independent abstract dynamism, all those great motions, an independent and abstract dynamism which does not ask to be loved or hated, seen or realized. Can one read such an energetic and atmospheric poem of northern New England spring without ascribing it to a self-consciously American poet? Should not a historical or literary critical description of the modern American poet include a poem such as this, placed within the indifferent universe of modern physics? Would a reading that saw this merely as a poem about spring weather be adequate to its import? Would a reading that saw this merely as a modernist poem refusing the consolations of religion do justice to its wholly American set of images, its forsythia, the babyishness of forsythia, as he says elsewhere, its forsythia and magnolia? This is an American revision of pastoral, without the giant of the weather, and needs to be admired for its conscious American attitudes towards the universe in itself and its dynamism and our place within it. Incidentally, none of these poems mentioned as American at all by the current commentary on collected poems of Stevens by Eleanor Cook. She says about the weather poem, "The outer world of early spring becomes a painting, and a painting seems to take on the actuality of an outer world. Stevens revises traditional religious language for spring's resuscitation." And it's not connected at all to an American sense of a situation in the modern universe or to the distinctly New England weather that's in it. My second example from the second part of Notes, It Must Change, and again, let me talk about it for a moment before you start reading it. It takes up in abstract form the intimately American theme, probably the most American theme of all our themes, which is immigration. The poem speaks of a past country left behind. It talks about a present country where a habitation originally unfamiliar has become a beloved place, and it suggests a yearning for a distant future. America is an immigrant country. There is always a former country we have come from in our successive waves. And we are a nomadic population. There is always an imagined frontier to which we aspire. These are not the experiences of European countries, which were in Stevens' day especially more homogeneous and settled in language and boundaries than the United States. So when the American poet declares it must change, he imagines that change in three color-identified time places: a pink past, a blue and green and orange present, and an aspired to tropical yellow. In these time places, he sets his figure of temporal change, a planter now dead. The planter, who emigrated from the pink country of melons, established himself deeply in his new island landscape, one that in time came to feel as he lived there utterly his own. His beautiful blue island, matching in color the sky-wide water surrounding it, and originally offering only a terrain of wild orange trees, under the planter's care grew greener and greener, its citrus color beginning at the degree zero of greenness with his new lime trees that he planted, but the green grew to tinge even the sun until it became a green sun, baking the planter's green lime trees ever greener. But even in the midst of his lime greens, the planter dreams of yellow fruits, pineapples, bananas, in a legendary tropical country, an El Dorado somewhere south of his beloved island. Now the planter is dead, and with the decay of his house, his island fruits have reverted to blotched patches and garbled, unintelligible colors. Colors without aesthetic or verbal emotional meaning. Orange blotches, the wild orange trees, garbled green, the lime trees. In dying, the poet tells us, the planter had to bid farewell to the simple banjo music that voiced for him his attachment to his island. Here is Stevens' abstract, yet completely open allegory of American being, immigrant, patriotic, and nomadic. On a blue island, all right. On a blue island in a sky-wide water, the wild orange trees continued to bloom and to bear long after the planter's death. A few limes remained where his house had fallen. 3 scraggy trees weighted with garbled green. These were the planter's turquoise and his orange blotches. These were his zero green, a green baked greener in the greenest sun. These were his beaches, his sea myrtles in white sand, his patter of the long sea slushes. There was an island beyond him, on which rested an island to the south, on which rested like a mountain a pineapple, pungent as Cuban summer. And là-bas, the cool bananas grew, hung heavily on the great banana tree, which pierces clouds and bends on half the world. He thought often of the land from which he came, how that whole country was a melon, pink if seen rightly, and yet a possible red. An unaffected man in a negative light could not have borne his labor, nor have died sighing that he should leave the banjo's twang. Reading Stevens' elegy for the immigrant settler, we feel the planter's touching piety towards his original land, merely pink when he left it, but capable, he feels, of evolving into a more passionate color. Think of the Irish or the Italians who came to this country when Italy was not yet unified, but they thought, maybe someday we'll really have a nation, or when Ireland was not free of the government of England, the Irish immigrants thinking, yes, but maybe one day it will happen, and there's a possible pure green in Ireland or a possible pure red in Italy. Well, they look back with fondness to the places they came from, but there's a critique of those places. They're only pink, but they somehow might be able to evolve into a possible red. And just as we feel the immigrant's nostalgia, we feel too his longing to sail là-bas, là-bas, where something larger and more golden would greet his eye. Incidentally, a lot of the references here are to Mignon's song in Goethe's Kennst du das Land, which turns into in the opera Mignon, Connais-tu le pays? But most of the reference here to the myrtles and the sea and the gold oranges are to the Goethe, where Goethe, instead of saying là-bas, là-bas, says dahin, dahin, there, there. It's a kind of paradisal look forward, as this is too. We need to explain why Stevens' narrative here takes place out of normal chronological order, as it gives us first the present, Panto living in the island, then the future, oh, if I could only get to the island where the cool bananas are, and finally the past, the country from which he came. Stevens gives these phases an order of their own, one of diminishing narrative space. 3 tercets for the present, 2 for the future, the bananas and the pineapples, and then 1 for the past, the country like a melon, pink. 3, 2, 1. So in the apportioning of the poem, habitation is more spacious than aspiration. Aspiration occupies more thought than recollection. Having tracked the relative importance of the planet's colored time spaces, Stevens needs an epitaph to, oh, am I doing something awful again?
I think it might be your cell phone, which is uncalled.
There's no cell phone in there, but that's all right. Cell phone is back in the hotel. It's funny. There's always a demon. Having tracked the relative importance of the planter's colored time spaces, Stevens needs an epitaph to complete the elegy. Shall he write a positive epitaph? The planter, the natural beauty of his island, expressed in his banjo's beloved twang? That would be merely an assertion. What the poet offers us as an epitaph is in fact a refutation. Somebody has said, but what value has the obscure, the obscure and restricted and laborious life of an immigrant who endured alone on an island, which after his death regressed to its original wild state? Stevens' epitaph refuses, while incorporating that bleak view by repudiating it in word after word, an unaffected man in a negative light could not have borne his labor, nor have died sighing that he should leave the banjo's twang. The planter's parting sigh, sighing that he should leave the banjo's twang, ratifies his own life satisfaction and his expression of it to himself in his banjo's twang. Can one read the parable of the planter and his former country, and the El Dorado for which he yearns, and the present life in which he has planted the lime trees and has become so attached even to the sea that they're his sea slushes as well as his fruits? Can one read the parable of the planter and not think of it as an illustration of the ever-triple existence of the American settler, former immigrant, and potential nomad? The American makes what music he can on his low folk instrument, a guitar or a banjo. He has no lute. He looks back often to the Europe, that melon land, of his literary inheritance, but finds it static. It's not evolving towards its possible red as far as he can see. Not yet. He speculates on a grander place, là-bas, that he might one day attain. But mostly he plants his trees, gathers his fruits, and grows to love so deeply his blue and orange and green and sunny island that he must voice that love of it in music. He is so intensely attached to his home that he grieves when he has to die and leave his instrument behind. We are reminded both of Stevens' hymns to Connecticut and his persistent longing for the palm at the end of the mind, as he says in his last poem. Years earlier, Stevens had wondered whether an ordinary earthly life, even if lived in solitude as the planter's was — Stevens can't give the planter a mate in this Eden because Stevens didn't have a proper mate himself, and he can't project onto the planter something he hadn't really experienced himself. He had a wife, but it was an unhappy marriage, and his wife was mentally ill, so you can't picture the planter with a wife. Years earlier, Stevens had wondered whether Stevens had wondered whether an ordinary earthly life, even if lived in solitude, could offer a fundamental balm and beauty. The planter's life demonstrates that Stevens now believes that it can. The woman in the 1923 Sunday morning, long ago, refusing Sunday ritual — she refuses to go to church — speculates on what could make up for the solace of belief and says, "Shall she not find in comforts of the sun, in pungent fruit and bright green wings, or else in any balm or beauty of the earth, things to be cherished like the thought of heaven?" The answer Stevens gave back in the days of Sunday morning in Harmonium, his first book, there was only perhaps she can find something solace in the balm and beauty of the earth. But the epitaph on the planter ratifies the planter's experience against a religious view regarding an earthly life as necessarily an unhappy one lived in a vale of tears. Isn't the planter a radically American figure rather than an impersonal abstraction? When Stevens defends an immigrant's integration of labor and love of place and music as sufficient, he is implicitly repudiating the ethical and intellectual emphasis of Emerson in favor of a more Thoreauvian life, motivated by memory, labor, imagination, sense pleasure, and musical expression. If I were to choose an American poem about immigration, I would prefer this one to Emma Lazarus's populist cry of the Statue of Liberty, "I lift my lamp beside the golden door." As we know, the door is not golden for all immigrants. That is one of those idealisms that is more pallid than actuality. Liberty is representing America as an El Dorado there, where one forgets one's past. When for most immigrants, a life of labor combined with regret for a lost land and an urge to move on to a better life is closer to that, a situation closer to that of the planter. All 31 of the cantos of Notes toward a Supreme Fiction can be read as statements about the predicament, work, beliefs, lived past, and future necessities of the specifically American writer. Read accurately, they are not merely about, quote unquote, the modern, and they're not merely about constructing modernism. The figures in the cantos are not expositions of a theory of quote unquote poetry in the abstract. Read with an eye towards their Americanness, the figures come alive, embodiments of problems for the poet hoping to establish a modern American set of aesthetic principles, and to exemplify those principles by means of allegorical figures, such as the planter. Literary history surely should reflect Stevens as a poet expressly concerned with the difficulties and opportunities of an authentically American poetry, its displacement from its European origins, its self-creation and domestication, and its yearning for the golden arrival of a later day, that golden nude of a later day, evolving from the paltry nude who starts on her spring voyage in an early poem. My last example, from part 3 of Notes, It Must Give Pleasure, at first appears to be a repudiation of poetic tradition in favor of a resolutely stripped down American aesthetic. Stripping down has been a major principle, of course, in American art, literature, and everything else. Williams, you can see stripping things down. You can see Andy Warhol stripping things down to soup cans. I mean, the idea that there is some primitive level at which we must find as Americans before we can construct something beyond it is a perennial fantasy. Cummings, of course, is full of it. Stevens doesn't believe that you have to go naked to be part of the new world. There's more enterprise in walking naked, says Yeats, but that was when he was throwing off his own earlier style. What is it, Stevens asks, that conventional poets love? And he doesn't want to be like them because they don't produce memorable or lasting poetry. But what is it that conventional poets always want to do? They always love. They love etymology. If they encounter a flower called an Argentine, they hear the echo of the French argent, silver, and want to bestow on Argentines a silver sheen. Conventional poets love classical allusion. When they see clouds as frothy, they want to give them classical resonance by calling them foamy, as if Venus might be born in the sky here as she was born in the sea originally. They love, conventional poets, to prettify nature, would anthropomorphize flowers, while suppressing recognition of the flowers' sexuality, their sexual fierce addictions. And those conventional poets love to compel the obedience of the objective to the subjective, to invite summer heat into their abortive dreams, as he says, coercing that summer heat to reform them, to take in human dreams, its natural form, the summer heat. All of these conventional poetic pleasures must, Stevens at first thinks, be rejected by the American poet, here allegorized as an American muse, a blue woman who arrives in her European guise, the way she used to be, elaborately decorated, linked and lacquered. I love the idea. Linked chains, all sorts of chains, and lacquered. It's perfectly smooth, glowing finish of lacquer. And there she is with all her jewelry and her perfect finish, sort of like a Vogue model of some kind, linked and lacquered. She, the blue woman, vows to recant her artificial trappings, to use denotative rather than connotative language, to be direct in speech rather than metaphorical, observant rather than transcendent, modern rather than classically allusive. Stevens' first 3 tercets enunciate her rejections of conventionality in poetry in intellectual, decisive, and resolved terms. She's not outside in nature. She's not pretending to be Venus from the waves. She is within civilization, looking out a window. The blue woman, linked and lacquered, at her window, did not desire that feathery Argentines should be cold silver, neither that frothy clouds should foam, be foamy waves, should move like them, nor that the sexual blossoms should repose without their fierce addictions, nor that the heat of summer, growing fragrant in the night, should strengthen her abortive dreams and take in sleep its natural form. For a canto appearing under the heading, "It Must Give Pleasure," this is dismayingly stern. What will the blue woman substitute for all the old diversions of poetry, all those links and all that lacquering? At first, Stevens thinks to offer a Wordsworthian consolation, memory. It was enough for her that she remembered. With the aid of the consolations of memory, can the blue woman keep to her ascetic present renunciations? In her reprise of the opening tercets, she once again presents, she hopes undecoratively, without links, without lacquer, the same initial Argentines, clouds, flowers, and heat, bracketing her reprise at beginning and end with the single statement, it was enough for her that she remembered. The Argentines of spring come to their places in the grape leaves to cool their ruddy pulses. The frothy clouds are nothing but frothy clouds. The frothy blooms waste without puberty. And afterward, when the harmonious heat of August pines enters the room, it drowses and is the night. It was enough for her that she remembered. But though the blue woman attempts to remain satisfied in pure, unadorned memory, her imagination moves secretly and even involuntarily underneath the lines of her reprise, bestowing intention, for instance, on the Argentines, which come in order to cool the ruddy pulses of the grapes, even while she refuses, by calling the grape pulses ruddy, the etymological temptation to silver them too. Even as she denies the flowers puberty, her word anthropomorphizes them once again, and the sliding of the cloud adjective frothy directly over to the flowers makes them into cloud-like frothy blooms. Her animal animation of heat as it enters the room and drowses, and her utterly metaphorical ascription of melodiousness to the warmth, the harmonious heat, display, to her regret, the impossibility of remaining objective, and in the way that she has been falsely persuading herself that language could be wholly denotative. Any new linguistic utterance is as imaginatively malleable as the rejected links and lacquers of the imitative Anglophilia practiced by many of Stevens' American predecessors. What is the blue woman to do? Something human, she fears, is always coloring her objective diction with a fictive tinge, just the way the sun turned green in the planters' among the planters' green limes. Trying to steel herself against the implications of human warmth and imaginative sensibility, the blue woman registers the pink and white dogwood before her with an exactness almost photographical. The blue woman looked, it's her ultimate of asceticism, the blue woman looked and from her window named the corals of the dogwood, cold and clear, cold, coldly delineating, being real, clear. So far, so good, perhaps. She's permitted, she thinks, to characterize the color as coral without any reference to the words origin and marine life. She intends no metaphor. Coral, cold, clear, cold, coldly clear, the lines clustering around the colorless verb delineating, wish to render the actual in naked objective words in austere lines. But then at last the poem, we are glad to see, collapses into truth. We are not photographic lenses, we are eyes, and eyes see perforce, humanly and emotionally. Cold, coldly delineating, being real, clear, and, except for the eye, without intrusion. The shocking word here is intrusion. It reveals an uninvited thrusting of the human eye into the glacial delineating, the unavoidable trespass of the human sensibility on natural phenomena. The American inclination to the factual and the pragmatic is an old error. The blue woman, desiring to strip flowers, clouds, and seasonal warmth of all metamorphic and human fluidity, errs in her vain belief that the verbal imagination can be quelled, that the eye can be rendered insusceptible to feeling, can confine itself to scientific denotation. In insidiously representing the impossibility of an inhuman objectivity, Stevens denies the conventional figure of nakedness for the New World. Any landscape, as Wordsworth had asserted at the close of his Immortality Ode, will always take on the color of the eye describing it, the intruding tinge of sensibility, temperament, emotion, the will to symbolic meaning. Stevens does not explicitly identify the epistemological issues behind his allegorical figures, but the resort to the denotative has been an urgent American perplexity in the 20th century. We all recall no ideas but in things. The other cantos of notes, most of them, can also be read, I believe, as manifestos by an American writer confronting the personal and artistic dilemmas of the new, theoretically democratic world, dilemmas of politics, aesthetics, gender, philosophy, religion, and rhetoric. The American muse, it turns out, is here not a classical revenant, as in Whitman, when Whitman says in Song of the Exposition, "Close up, please, all those immensely overpaid accounts of ancient Greece. Get the muse over here," and then he celebrates her. She's here, installed amid the kitchenware. That's where the domestic muse should be. Stevens doesn't quite do that. But he does put her behind a window, and he strips her of elusive allusions to the classical world. The American muse, it turns out, is here not a classical revenant, as in Whitman, or a purely interior paramour, as elsewhere in Stevens, but the earth itself. The muse is the round planet, what he calls Terra, the fat girl. It is Stevens who tells us the fat girl is the earth, what the politicians nowadays are calling the globe. He addresses her at the end of Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. She's seen always, he says, in a moving contour, abstract, changing, a perpetual source of sense pleasure in her appearances, of intellectual pleasure in her natural laws. At the close of Notes, the muse is addressed by her poet as an American figure, as yet unacknowledged in Paris, but fully present in Hartford. He says to her, "You remain the more than natural figure. You become the soft-footed phantom, the irrational distortion, however fragrant, however dear. That's it, the more than rational distortion, the fiction that results from feeling. Yes, that." They'll get it straight one day at the Sorbonne. Wonderful flip. In the new century, America is ahead of Paris. Poetic representations are always saturated with feeling, and some of Stevens' strongest feelings generate Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction and its allegorized dramatis personae. A feeling of total satisfaction with the life of vigorous emotion produces the energetic weather with its northern colors, its American flower songs and flower fragrances. The planter is a conduit for the American nostalgic love of ethnic roots, immigrant attachment to a new land, and distant longings for a golden future. The blue woman embodies at first the impossible decision to achieve, in American naming, a cold and clear delineation apparently more suitable to the New World than the outworn pathos of Romanticism. But the blue woman learns that the sense's unavoidable subjectivity will tinge even a description intended to be modern and factual. The question I would leave you with is whether Stevens' cantos in Notes become richer read as the work of a poet always conscious of his Americanness? And if so, whether we need to reinterpret Stevens' poems, many others besides these, reinterpret his poems, whatever their ostensible subject, a blue woman or a planter, as thoroughly American in their voicing of the perplexities, the aims, and the fidelities of the modern American poet. Literary history will take on a more lustrous and truer contour when it acknowledges in Stevens a poet always aware of his American obligation to investigate through and through what a modern American sensibility could accurately express. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.